work session of the Eugene City Council to order. And on the phone should be Councilor Syrett and Councilors Clark.
I'm here.
Councilor Clark is here and present. Councilor Syrett, are you there?
Nope, not yet.
And,
Not yet. We'll hear her beep.
And I think Councilor Taylor is on her way, and I think also Councilor Zelenka. So our first item up for this evening is a work session, our annual report of the Civilian Review Board, and the police auditor's triannual report. So,
That should be Claire on the phone.
Yeah, I think Claire's on.
Claire, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, Councilor Syrett is here. And first up, let's keep going. We'll go to
Civilian Review Board.
Civilian Review Board. So, and we have Councilor Taylor. So why don't we go straight ahead? So who's going to be first to present?
Thank you. I'm Bernadette Conover. I'm the chair of the Civilian Review Board. Council, members of the public, thank you for the opportunity to present our annual report. Clearly, the delay for getting on the agenda was as much of a frustration for you as it was for us. We look forward to presenting in a more timely manner next year. While the CRB has some current events that could be discussed today, we would prefer to keep this report about the 2014 annual report, which you have had, each have had a chance to read. We continue to review cases in the same systematic way that we have for the past few years, reviewing at least one case each year at the behest of a citizen complainant, reviewing a variety of service complaints, and then the bulk of our case reviews are cases brought to our attention through the case review summaries provided by the auditor's office. Most months, case reviews require members to spend several hours reviewing reports, video, and audio files. There is an expectation that members will spend enough time reviewing the case files in order to be fully engaged in the discussion. It is highly commendable the amount of hours of thought and review that each of our members put into each meeting. Of course, none of this would be possible without the outstanding work by the staff of the Auditor's Office. Each month, we are reminded that Mark and Leah are available for each of our members to discuss details of cases in order that we may make an informed decision about which case should be taken for a full review by the full board. As in the past years, we met more than our required 4 times. We tackled some cases of public attention. We reviewed cases where officers were found to have violated policies. Other cases reviewed found officers had not violated policies. In discussions, we challenged each other's assumptions, pushed to find truth, and hopefully succeed in our goal of transparency. There are 2 prongs to the CRB. First, we inform the public as to the why behind police actions and inform the police as to the concerns members of the public have over events as they have unfolded and perhaps have been resolved in some other manner. From our perspective, the police department has been receptive to the citizen concerns. In order for there to be a successful dialogue, both sides need a willingness to listen and trust information can be exchanged and parties can begin to see each side in a new light. This is an ongoing issue for the City of Eugene and its community. The CRB strives toward understanding between parties in an often complex and dynamic situations. We thank you for the opportunity to present, and if you have questions regarding our report, we will do our best to answer those questions.
Thank you, Chair Conover. Does anyone have any questions for the Civilian Review Board? Not seeing any. Well, go ahead. Councilor Pryor.
Yeah. Not having any questions doesn't mean that we're not incredibly impressed with the work you did. I mean, we did read through the report, and I think the questions we would have would have been probably related to, questions. And since the report was so thorough, I was just going back and looking at it again, and what I liked about the report was the fact that you talked about specific cases and how you would process those and what your process was for working on those. And that's always very helpful for me to understand how that works. And so from that standpoint, I'm really impressed with the work you do and how thorough you are, but also I think your effort to try to be as objective and as thoughtful as you can, which for me was, I think, one of the things we most looked for when we were doing both the auditor and the Civilian Review Board was the ability to provide that third set of eyes that could bring a thoughtfulness and an objectivity, and I think you've done exactly that. And so going back and looking at these cases over again, I'm impressed at how thoroughly you look at them. And as you said yourself, you take the time to do it right. And I think that's really a credit. And so as a result, I go, wow, this is great. I don't have any questions. You're doing a really good job. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Councilor Pryor.
Councilor Zelenka.
Yeah, I'll reiterate that and expand on it. It's a very thorough report, and thank you for your service and everybody else that's on the CRB that's here or watching for everything that you do in regard to this commission. It's an important one, and I know Councilor Surratt and Evans are the liaisons, and they meet with you on a regular basis.
No, that's Councilor Clark. I'm not on Civilian Review. Councilor Surratt, Councilor Clark.
On the Civilian Review Board.
Civilian Review Board.
Okay, and and they would brief us of any issues that you guys would have that would be brought to our attention, and they haven't, so we don't really have any. But I'd also like to reiterate, I really like the narrative around the cases in the report, because it gives me a sense of what you've been up to and what you've been deciding about and what the issues are before the CRB. And I think that's a good way to present this work, because it really lays it out very clearly about what you're doing as the CRB and what kind of conclusions you're making.
Claire or Mike, any comments, questions? Are you still there? Counselors?
And maybe on mute.
Maybe so. Okay. So I'm not hearing anything from either one of them. I will.
Sorry,
Oh,
Greg.
okay.
I'm unmuted. This is Claire. I don't have any comments at the time. Just thank the CRB for their great work.
Okay. Thank you, Claire. I like to echo that same
I
sentiment.
echo that remark as well.
All right, Mike, that's great too. So, yeah, I echo the same sentiment. I want to thank you for your work and the volunteer time that you folks put in, and particularly the fact I want to note that we have a system in Eugene that works. And there are a lot of cities that are grappling with police, community relations, and are struggling with that. And I think that since we have instituted the Civilian Review Board and subsequently the police auditor's position, that there is a lot more transparency with the police department and the community. And while we do have issues and struggles, as you know, we note through the report, we have a clear path to process that. And for me, I think that really works very well. And I know there are many people in the community that, you know, may have issues from time to time with the police department, but I think that the oversight, the civilian oversight, is incredibly important, and we have demonstrated in this city that it works. So I want to thank you for that. And then, Councilor?
Yeah, I did have one question, and it's actually an inquiry. It was prompted by something that Councilor Evans said, which is that in this community, and part of our community in the form of the U of O Police Department doesn't have a police auditor function in it. And I'm wondering if you guys have had, and Mark, you can answer this question too, if the Civilian Review Board or the police auditor have had any conversations recently about moving that forward within the University of Oregon's police department. Because those folks, they have jurisdiction within our city, but they're essentially exempt from this, and that's somehow seems inappropriate if they are exercising their police powers in our city, but not under the rubric of the police auditor.
No conversations in probably over a year.
Any other comments? Yeah. Thank you, Bernadette.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And we'll turn it over to our police auditor, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am asked to provide a triannual report to the council, and this was an opportunity to do that. Nothing of particular interest per se that we have this time around, no particular issues. I meet monthly with Presidents Saret and Vice President Evans to talk about some of the issues and housekeeping issues and things like that, how our things are going with our office. I appreciate your time on those and your counsel on that. Recently, we just, the review board wrapped up the officer-involved shooting with Mr. Brian Babb. I really appreciate the difficult work that the review board put into that. I think, if memory serves, it was about a 16-gigabyte thumb drive of information. And one of the things that I take great recognition in is the review board. They do their homework before they come to the meetings. They're very well prepared, and they're ready for questions and comments. And so I really appreciate the hard work they put in before they come to the meeting and then in the meeting as well. Several family members came to our November meeting, came to the October meeting to listen to the discussion. The way the protocols are, they're not allowed to comment about a case that's being talked about that month, so they came the following month as well. I wish there was a process where they could have their concerns addressed earlier. I'm not sure that the review board is the forum to talk about a deadly officer-involved shooting or not for a family member to wait during that period of time. I don't necessarily have an answer, but I appreciate their frustration of having to wait so long before they got a chance to air their issues. It was a grieving family, and we all had sympathy for them, and I think before, quite honestly, everybody lawyered up, that they would have had a chance to at least express some of their concerns and issues that they might have had before we got to the review board. But I don't also have another answer for that. In terms of complaints, we're about where we were last year. It's difficult for us to manage the size of the current caseload with our staffing resources. Leah Pitcher and Vicki Cox do a great job for us. We get a lot of customer service complaints. We have a lot of people in Eugene who are from other parts of the country where police officers respond to non-injury traffic accidents, and personal reports are taken when there's a crime that's committed. And because of the staffing issues here and the resource issues, that's a little bit more difficult. And when you've just been a crime victim, or your parked car has been hit by someone that took off and an officer doesn't come out, that can be very frustrating for people. We're that first avenue for which they air their frustration. We've had a slight increase probably in terms of allegations, but those are mostly recognized. Quite honestly, with the we talked about it before, the Blue Team software program, which tracks uses of force and other major incidents. We're on track to review about 200 of those now, so we take a look at every one of those, and that's added to our workload, but it's a good thing that we look at those. In addition, they've just added, every time now they send out that Bearcat rescue vehicle, that's now being tracked and reviewed so that everyone, command staff and us, can look at it to make sure that it is being tracked and utilized appropriately. We appreciate the sergeants on scene doing the use of force reporting. And we haven't had a chance to crunch the data. Leah was just at a conference to learn how to do those reports with the data we have from Blue Team. But my opinion is we're starting to see a shift in terms of approaches to people who are less than warm when a police officer addresses them. And we haven't put it into data yet, But again, reviewing use of forces over the course of the past year, it seems as if there's a reduction in force-related issues. I've asked the chief, is there also a parallel reduction in arrests? And he says no. So I think that they are learning to disengage and de-escalate more than they have in the past. To what degree, we'll try to crunch some data on that to get that out there. But I think that I'm seeing a shift in approaches to problems, and not just going on hands-on right away, but really trying to gain some cooperation from folks. We'll see if that really plays. Shifting back to the Civilian Review Board, again, just some housekeeping things. We have 2 new members, Lindsay Foltz and Heather Merrick. They replaced George Rohde and Deborah Velour, who both did outstanding work for us, and I think we're with us for about 4 years and really appreciate their contributions. Stephen McIntyre, who's been on the board for a while, he was approved as a CRB member appointed to serve on the Police Commission. I think he enjoys it. Heather Merrick was designated as the CRB liaison to the Human Rights Commission. So we have new people in those positions, and I think that they'll help with the discussions. The other issue in terms of workload, we're working with Human Resources and the Budget Office to create a part-time position in our office for a program specialist to coordinate community engagement activities and provide bilingual services for our customers who have Spanish as their first language. We'll initially introduce it as a limited duration position, about 20 hours a week, and see if that need exists. We've also put signage on the door that's in Spanish now, and see if that works in outreaching to some of the grassroots community groups. I think we all recognize that no matter what group or whatever demographic you are, it's not all under one umbrella. And so there's all kinds of grassroots organizations in our community, and we're trying to reach more of those in our processes. But I know, for example, as I said, we get about 425 complaints. If I would compare that to Philadelphia, it gets about 73, something like that. I think Boise gets like 139, something like that. That's just kind of off the top of my head. So we do a lot of intake. I think, quite honestly, we do a lot of ombudsman work where we're trying to problem solve for people and help out. In terms of walk-ins, most of our walk-ins now are people who aren't skilled at email and websites, or might not even have telephones. We get our fair share of people who are either in long-term mental health care or in mental health crisis. Vicki does an absolutely fabulous job in dealing with folks who are in mental health crisis. I'm not sure we've ever had someone who's been in mental health emergency, and I'm not sure how we would handle that, but certainly close at times that we've had folks with regard to that. In terms of other initiatives, the police department is ready to roll out the experimental stage anyway on the smartphone application to give to officers to track stops. If you're stopped by a police officer, it'll track demographic characteristics to test to see if there's bias-based policing. And I think it's only one of the few, if the only one in the country right now that's designed specifically for that. I hate to give away our design secrets at this point because there might be some sort of proprietary benefit from that, but the police department and Captain Camcar worked very hard to get this in place, and it was designed by a person from Public Works who helped us put it together. So I'm really looking forward to that, and it's quick. one of the concerns with keeping paper on stops and potential profiling is the time it takes and the officer time, and this is usually under a minute to accomplish this. So I'm looking forward to that. As I said, the case management engulfs a vast majority of our time. I always say it takes about 120% of my time. The officer-involved shooting was consumed an awful lot of time for us, as they always do. And I think one of the successes or failures in a civilian oversight agency is not being nimble and quick enough to deal with those things. There's other agencies in other cities where it takes years to resolve an officer-involved shooting. So on the major incidents, we still have to have that window that allows us to concentrate on those particular cases and hope that through the service complaints that the sergeants and the supervisors are able to deal with those particular issues. So I think all things considered, a turnaround time all the way to the review board of 7 months for that very complicated shooting, even though it was only one bullet, I think that we did really well on that. And again, I appreciate the work on the CRB. In addition, I've been working at the state level to assist a working group with developing the statewide racial profiling complaint system. It was well-intended legislation, but operationally there was a lot of gaps there. And so I worked with the, I forget the name of the subcommittee that was involved in that, went up to Salem several times and helped them design their forms and things like that. The jury's still out on it. I researched other states. For example, Kansas would get about 20 a year, or was it? Yeah, 28 a year. I think 20 of them were from Wichita. So I don't know how effective it'll be at the state level. We'll see, but I'm sure marketing has a lot to do with that as well. But I did check other states, and the statewide efforts in the other states as well has been very limited. I don't know if that's a resource thing or what, but we'll see how that works out. In January, I get to work with 2 missions in internal affairs out of 3, so I'll have to go into another sort of training mode.
Lost your
I
microphone.
think your mic is gone.
Grab that one over there.
Oh, it did go red, didn't it? So, probably didn't hear half of what I said. So there'll be 2 new people in internal affairs, and we'll be working with them as well. Leah's still doing a good job on our newsletter, and I think that, again, things are going very well. I know that the chief has spent a lot of time with his staff on shifting training to a more de-escalation type model, and hopefully that'll work well for us. Again, it seems like most of the use of force lately have been people with significant drug addiction issues more than anything, far less on mental health crisis. Not to say that it doesn't occur, but they have been responding on a number of cases with people in mental health crisis. But there seems to be some sort of drug out there right now that's causing some problems as well. So beyond that, I think we're doing really well, all things considered, and it's a blessing to be here. It's a great job, and really enjoying it.
Thanks, Mark. Questions? Councilor Pryor.
Yeah, great report. I really appreciate the work you're doing, and I'm pleased, as I've said many times before, about how you have made the auditor's position work really well as a connection and a liaison between the police department, the city, and the community. And I think that is exactly what we wanted it to be. So I'm then thinking into something that you talked about in terms of increasing the ability for the auditor's office to be engaged with the community. And I know this is something that has come up over and over again. And I realize in the operational parts of your job, you do have a very heavy workload. And so the notion that you might want to look for some additional bandwidth to be able to work that engagement element, I think is very important, because part of the job, as you pointed out, isn't just working through the cases and adjudicating them, but also helping to increase understanding and support for what the auditor function is. And so I think a real engagement effort is about more than just making people aware that the auditor's office is there, but also making them understand and support the effort that's going on. And that does take more time and effort than just sending out some ads or mailing some flyers. And so I think that may be the long way around for me to say, I really appreciate your efforts to try to create engagement, and if it takes some additional bandwidth to be able to do that with the rest of your workload, I think it's time and resources well spent, because an important part of your job is making sure the community understands and supports what you're doing. So I would say I would be supportive of you working to try to accomplish that.
We've also talked about with the review board is the linkage to the community and the people on the review board.
Yeah.
To make sure that the community understands that they're there to represent them. Sometimes at times we might be, like, for example, lawyer heavy or whatever, but these are still people in the community that they ought to have a linkage to, and we're working on that as well. And we have a very interested review board in making sure that that linkage widens.
Councilor Poling.
Thank you. First, Mark, I just want to acknowledge the fact that we're very appreciative of the work that you and your staff do in the police auditor position. It's very important work that you do, and I'm glad to see that the community, the department, everybody else is, I hate to use this term, but really buying into this program and really making it work. I do have one question, and it might be better asked to the chief. Unfortunately, he's not here, but maybe you have some insight into it. Something you said about the 2 of the 3 internal affairs positions are going to be new ones coming up. Is that by design, or did somebody request to be transferred out? Because a position like IA takes a certain skill and a certain personality, and to have 2 new people come on at the same time, to me, is a little troubling, and I don't know the reason for it, but you think it would be better to rotate one at a time in and out of there. Do you have any information on that?
It's by design. They've instituted a rotation program for sergeants and lieutenants. So, for example, a lieutenant's not embedded in one particular position for 10 years. It allows them to grow. It gives the organization more variety. Sergeant Nelson has been there 4 years, grooming others in those positions, and has done a fantastic job for us. The ones that are leaving, Sergeant Vinci just left. He'll be in charge of the Special Investigations Unit. It's something that I've experienced my entire career, being in internal affairs, as you said, over the course of even 2 or 3 years, where you're now investigating your colleagues, is not an easy position. So one of the persons, she was in internal affairs as a sergeant, Lieutenant Mason. She'll be in charge of it now, so she has some previous experience in internal affairs. So I think it's manageable. They get vigorous oversight from our office, from myself and Ms. Pitcher, and I think I'm certain that they appreciate that. So I think we'll be fine.
Thank you.
Councilor Taylor.
Thank you. I just have a question. Have you attended very many neighborhood meetings?
We attend some. We try to invite ourselves. Again, normally, as you probably experience, if there's an incident-specific issue that's before them, then they'll ask for us to talk to it. Early on, when I started, we went to a lot more, and they understood them. But at best, the interest is tepid unless something's happened or occurred. So, but we reach out to them on a regular basis.
I think it would be good to, the neighborhoods, the makeup of the neighborhoods has changed over the years. And I think as you have time, it would be good to try to go to neighborhoods and take a few minutes to explain what you do and answer any questions they have.
I'd love to have 5 or 10 minutes with each of them every month, or how often they meet. But I know, they have other interests as well, so.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Brown.
Thank you. I just have a question, and I probably should have asked this when Ms. Conover was here, because it's in the Civilian Review Board section of the material. But I just noticed, again, one of the training sessions was held in September, community engagement. I'm just wondering if you were at that particular training and what involved with that.
Well, I think that was, we had a strategy session, correct me if I'm wrong, staff, on ways in which the CRB can be more involved in the, community engagement, in other words. And I think, for example, at times even whether just a review board member goes to a session so maybe the audience doesn't feel as if it's more auditor kind of thing, but it's that actual interaction. So, as I said, we're working on it. I'm writing letters right now to send out to people and what we hope to achieve.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I know, it's tough. We think, well, you need to be out in the community more. Well, you try, and I've been to neighborhood meetings, and there's 10 people there. And I've been to other ones when there was an issue, a very important issue that concerned that neighborhood, and there was widespread interest and concern. There'll be 100 sometimes. So you never know. And sometimes the agendas are booked up, believe it or not, some of them months in advance, and it's not even easy for a city councilor to get on the agenda at a neighborhood meeting sometimes. So.
My wife's on the board of one, and she gets frustrated by either the lack of attendance or the same people. Again, thankfully, I'm not behind any zoning changes or things like that. We'd probably get more attention, but I think we're just very issue specific. If we're impacted by it directly, I think that's what is attractive for people.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. That seems to be the norm of other issues just beside, police investigations. Thank you.
Councilor Clark, Councilor Syrett, questions, comments?
No, thank you, sir.
Councilor Syrett?
I'm good, Chris.
Okay. I have a couple of questions for you, Mark. One, with going back with regard to the recent police shooting, you noted there's no real way of, and of course there's, each incident is different and has its own issues and characteristics, but is there a model for victim family engagement that you've seen in other parts of the country that, maybe there's pieces of that could be applied to this recent situation that hopefully we won't have incidents in the future like this, but of course that could very well happen, and ways that we can do, victim family engagement better than for, if we're doing it okay, then, that's all fine and well, but we're always looking to get better. So where are you at with that?
I'll look around. It's because they're so rare here, sort of conceptualizing it in our circumstances. In Cincinnati, where we had a lot more officer-involved shootings, it was, the folks usually came to city council and aired their grievance, but that was still when the temperature was pretty high. I just really felt the frustration of the family to just not have an opportunity to just share their feelings about things until, again, they did at the review board. And if there's, and I'll look at see how other folks do it, certainly. And if there's a way in which they have an opportunity just to share how they feel about it sooner, I think that would be a good thing for everybody. These are just good, hard-working people who lost a loved one in a very tragic situation, and just it was a long time before they really had a chance to talk about it. And if we can find a way to do that, and I'll certainly look into ways to do that, I think it would be better for everyone.
Okay. And one other thing, going to item 4 on your report in attachment B, precisely where are you in human resources at in terms of moving the issue of adding a bilingual or multicultural liaison to your staff?
We've completed the job specification, worked with, and she's kind of new in HR, and I forgot her name, and I wish I hadn't because she's done a great job. And the budget office is already aware, and so we've got focused in on what we want. So the next step is going to be, it'll be part of our budget proposal. In the meantime, again, I've been talking to some grassroots organizations if they know someone who might be interested in something like that. And again, we'll try it at 20 hours a week, and hopefully someone, well, we can now put in there with a little extra pay, apparently, a bilingual person. So that's going to be some very important characteristics for us. So we'll be ready for it next budget cycle, certainly.
So it's a 0.2 FTE that you're looking at?
Probably about a 0.5.
A 0.5, okay.
Yeah, limited duration to see where, if you will, the supply and demand is, and then reassess it after the first year.
Okay. Any other questions or comments for Mark? Mark, well, again, thank you for an excellent job, excellent report. Doing great work, man.
Thank you. It's truly a pleasure to be here and work for City Council and the community and the mayor. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to the next item on our agenda, the work session on climate recovery targets and benchmarks. So we have... Oh, okay. So in the meantime, does anyone have any problem with us proceeding with the consent calendar and getting that dealt with before we get into the body of the meeting? We can do that now, then we can get it done. So why don't we go ahead and do the consent calendar? So. I think Betty probably should go ahead and make those motions because you are technically the dean of the group tonight.
Okay. I move to approve the items on the consent calendar.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any questions, discussions? All those in favor signify by raising your hand. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Aye.
Aye. And Councilor Syrett?
Aye.
So it's 8-0, and the consent calendar has been approved. And we will move into our climate recovery discussion. As we have dispensed with that.
I'll turn
The
it
city
over
manager.
to Babe and Matt to take us through a presentation.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to pull up the screen there. My name is Matt McCrae, Climate and Energy Analyst for the city. I met you all. Thanks for taking the time. I have a brief presentation, 10 minutes or less, so we can leave the remainder of the time for you to have conversation. So here's where I'm headed. Brief overview of the Climate Recovery Ordinance. You're all familiar with it, but just a reminder for others that are watching. And then I'm going to break this bulk of the talk into two parts. So I'm going to focus first on internal targets and benchmarks, and then I'll take a quick break there and ask for clarifying questions, and then I'll go on to community targets and benchmarks. So just a reminder, you're all familiar with this. The Climate Recovery Ordinance that was passed in July of 2014 clarifies and codifies our existing goals. So we have a community-wide fossil fuel reduction goal to reduce fossil fuel use overall, not per capita, by 50% by 2030, and then a carbon-neutral city operations goal by 2020. The Climate Recovery Ordinance calls for an assessment of current efforts, and we reported that to you in February. It calls for targets and benchmarks to achieve the existing goals, and that's what we're going to talk with you about today. And it also calls for development of a science-based community greenhouse gas reduction goal, and we haven't had that conversation with you yet. It calls for regular progress reports to Council and establishes a process of analysis, reporting, and readjustment if community or internal targets are not met. So briefly, our internal climate action trends and targets and benchmarks. Just as a reminder, we do have an internal climate action plan. It was developed in 2009, and we've done internal greenhouse gas inventory work and reporting in order to continue to monitor progress on those goals and that action plan. A few highlights, and you may recall some of these. Eugene Police Department has begun to purchase a new pursuit vehicle that once they are all replaced will be saving somewhere on the order of $200,000 a year in fuel costs, which is pretty remarkable. I'm told that actually today the first of the LED streetlights went in. We're replacing some 4,700 streetlights with new technology that will save quite a bit of energy. We've made substantial upgrades in numerous facilities. They're not really very sexy to look at, but they do save energy, new HVAC systems and weatherproofing and the like. And then, as you know, our public works staff are really leading the way when we think about emissions associated with the products and services that we're providing. They're doing more mixed asphalt, and they're leading other ways to reduce the amount of energy that's embedded in the products that we're using. A really high overview of our internal greenhouse gas emission sources. Transportation is about 8%. Buildings, pools, and lighting accounts for about 30%. A lot of that's natural gas use for heating facilities. And then a big piece of it is our supply chain emissions. So again, construction of roads and the like, the emissions that go into the products that go into those roads and other construction projects. And then very briefly, the trends and the targets. So these are not emissions; they are the emission sources. So we're looking at natural gas on the top in red, transportation fuel use, and electricity use in blue. And at the bottom, you can see our steam use tapered off and stopped in 2012. So you can see the trends they're flattening out. In the case of electricity, headed slightly downward, which is really great to see. The target that is being proposed, if you recall, so it's a carbon neutral operations is the goal here. The target we're proposing is that we would achieve 60% reduction in emissions and then offset what remains. So recognizing that it'd be extremely difficult for us to completely eliminate emissions from internal operations, but still this is a pretty aggressive goal to reduce emissions by 60% and then purchase offsets for the remaining. So pretty steep reductions there would be called for, somewhere on the order of 15% annual reductions. Questions on the internal stuff before I go to the community side? And certainly there will be
any questions from council? Councilor Surratt, Councilor Clark? I know.
Yes, sir.
I know you can't see the presentation, but on television. Never mind. Okay.
All right.
Greg, I'd like to get in the queue too, please.
You're in the queue? Okay, Mike.
He is the queue.
You are the queue then. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, sir, very much. And I can watch. I am watching it on the television, but it's
I keep forgetting that.
So,
yeah.
40 seconds off.
So,
my question is with regards to the Eugene Airport and the fuel that's both purchased and sold and used there. Is that a part of internal measurements or external measurements?
That really mostly figures into external measurements. There is this inventory that I just showed you does include the equipment that city vehicles use to operate in the airport. So that's incorporated here on the internal side. But I think what you're getting at, the jet fuel, et cetera, is contained in the community-wide inventory.
Is that purchased by the city and sold, or is that something that's done privately at our airport?
You know, that's a great question, and I'll hesitate to speculate. I don't know the answer to that question, but I can find out for you.
I'd like that very much because I think that should be an internal measurement. At least it occurs to me logically that that should be the case. Thank you.
Kurt, you.
FBO.
Fixed base operator.
The fixed base operator purchases the airport fuel, not the airport itself. Thank you.
So it's in a consortium.
Thank you for that.
A fixed base operator is a private entity that will provide services on airport fuel, maintenance, services, and those kind of things. And so they'll purchase their fuel and then sell it to the airlines or to private general aviation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else, Mike?
No, sir, that's it just for the moment.
Okay.
All right,
Proceed.
so I'll jump into the community side, which is about the same length, fairly short here. Just a reminder that we have a community-wide climate and energy action plan that was put in place in 2010. We worked with a number of community members and stakeholders to develop that plan, and it contains really the bulk of the direction for emissions reductions and climate adaptation strategies. So just briefly, it includes strategies focused on buildings and energy consumption, food and agriculture, land use and transportation, consumption and waste, and again, it gets at the embodied energy portion of our footprint, health and social services, which is really more focused on climate adaptation than emissions reduction, and urban natural resources, looking at our waterways, our air, our trees, and the like, again, primarily focused on climate adaptation. So a couple of highlights on the community side. We're experiencing really great redevelopment in the downtown area. This is directly in line with the goals here to make it easier for more people to have better access to services without relying as heavily on an automobile. So people that are living downtown have great access, and so the more we're adding folks in those areas and adding services, it makes it easier for people to get around without as much auto use. It also makes our bus service more effective. Areas where there are more people, it make the bus service more efficient. I'm not sure if you heard, LTD has also purchased its first handful of electric buses, all electric buses, which is really pretty exciting. There aren't that many communities in this country that have done that, so they're out in front there. But those are expected to save money as well. And lastly, this guy who, this is Eric Leahy, a shout out to him for posing for this photo. But he's helping to promote our Love Food Not Waste program, which diverts commercial food waste out of the landfill and puts it into a composting facility and preventing the methane release from landfill operations. So those are just a few of the ways that we're seeing emissions reductions on the community side. Again, very briefly, greenhouse gas emission sources. This is based on an updated greenhouse gas inventory that we just completed. So the sources, again, waste, which includes landfill emissions and emissions from our wastewater treatment facility, are about 5%. Buildings and building energy use, heating and lighting, et cetera, are about 18%. Transportation is a pretty good portion at 37%. And materials, again, this is the embodied energy in the goods and products that we consume, as well as food. It ends up being about 40% of our total emissions footprint. So then looking at community-wide energy trends. So again, this isn't emissions. It's broken down by the energy sources themselves. At the top there in green is electricity use. The blue, which is in the middle, is natural gas use. and the red is gasoline and diesel use. They're all headed on a downward trajectory. A few important notes here. You can see the line, the vertical line there is 2008. The trend is going in the right direction, but we also need to recognize that certainly the economic downturn contributed to some portion of this. But if you look at the emissions reductions before that, we can see that these aren't all resulting from economic downturn. And certainly we're not looking for economic contraction as a way to reduce our emissions. Another important point here, we're seeing a steady downward trend across all these areas, around 2% per year, while our population has been growing. So this is total use altogether, and at the same time our population has grown, so it magnifies the reductions. So then here's the marker for a 50% reduction. This is the target, the community target that you all have set within the Climate Recovery Ordinance, and that would require continued reductions on the order of about 2.5% per year. And again, we're on that trajectory. We're seeing that over the past 8 or 9 years now, continued average downward trend. So it's going in the right direction. So very briefly, there are questions about how do we get there? We've done some actions, taken some actions, and I just want to. This is just a quick sketch of the strategies that we use to reduce emissions, both internally and on the community side. And I'm sorry this doesn't read very easily for us, but on the building side, it's really around making smarter buildings. There's a lot of technology that's just coming available to allow us to better use the energy that comes to our buildings, improve building energy efficiency, and then shifting away from fossil fuels in our buildings, which is typically natural gas, and moving to electricity or biofuels. And then taking our electricity and moving that to 100% renewables. We have here in the Pacific Northwest, we have a high percentage of renewables, and it's important that we maintain that and further increase the amount of renewables that we're using. And on transportation, it's much the same. It's reducing the amount that we're using through carpooling, busing, biking, walking, etc. And then taking the fossil fuel that we are using and pushing it to either electricity or biofuels. And then making sure, again, that our electricity remains high in renewables and continuing to increase the amount of renewable energy that we're using for power. And then on the consumption side, the materials that we're consuming, we really do a pretty decent job here of taking care of our waste and recycling. But this is really more about thinking how can we reduce the amount of materials that we're consuming in the first place. Reducing the amount of food waste. And we talked a little bit about that. And then shifting to buying durable goods and things that can be repairable. And then finally, taking that time and those resources that we're then not investing in things that get thrown away, but rather using that time to help people spend more time with their family. So that is the end of what I have prepared for you. At some point when you're ready, I know Glenn's prepared to speak to next steps as far as incorporating the benchmarks and targets, but we can do that at any point. So, thank you.
So I have Councilor Taylor in the queue, Councilor Zelenka, but I have a question for you before I go to Councilor Taylor.
Yeah.
So have you done an overlay or a geographic map, if you will, of the distribution of emissions and carbons throughout the city? One of the things that I note is that in other cities and bigger cities, there is always seems to be a disproportionate amount of emissions, waste, pollution that's concentrated in poor areas. And so since I represent one of the poor areas of the city, I am particularly interested on the distribution of emissions and other pollutants, not only in my ward, but in other wards that are adjacent to my ward as well, wards 7 and 8 in particular, because we have a high concentration of industrial activity in our areas, as well as the airport being in my ward too. So do we have that kind of overlay that we can look at that and see where we need to really kind of accelerate our efforts, in those directions so that we can have some geographic symmetry in terms of reducing emissions in areas that are more adversely impacted than others?
That's a great question, and there's a bunch of pieces there, so I'm going to try and answer it, and if I miss something, help me refresh my memory. To answer first, no, we don't have something right now where we can look at total emissions as they're distributed across the community, but there are a few pieces where we can say something. When we look at, a few things that I'll speak to and then say I'd suggest probably aren't big sources. So electricity consumption doesn't typically tend to have a lot of emissions associated with it. Where it's being used, the emissions are where the electricity is being generated, typically. And then natural gas consumption tends to be very clean. When we think about emissions like particulate emissions, it doesn't tend to have a lot of those. So I would say those sources of our emissions probably of lesser concern than transportation fuels. When we look at transportation fuels, we can see that there are more emissions per household for households that are at the perimeter of town. So folks who live further in towards town, to the middle of town, tend to have fewer emissions per household than those who live outside. But where those emissions actually take place, I'm not sure we could speak to. Will make the caveat that we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions and not so much at particulate, which is important to look at, but not something that we're tracking right now. But I would suspect that LRAPA could speak more directly to particulate emissions and where the problem areas are. And yes, by and large, my understanding is the same as your understanding, is that lower income areas tend to bear more of the brunt of especially particulate emissions. I would say one thing about equity, which is one of the things that you're getting to here, is that a lot of lower income homes and rental homes don't have access to or are unable to take advantage of the weatherization opportunities and the energy efficiency opportunities that homeowners are able to take advantage of. So I think you're concerned about equity and how and where we start helping out those who are least able to afford it and who are disproportionately affected is really important, and that is something that we're attentive to and thinking about how to roll out programs. It's really difficult, as you probably know, to help to do the energy efficiency within like multifamily buildings. It's a tough nut to crack. Because the building owner may or may not be invested in seeing those reductions, and the property, the resident may or may not actually get the gain from turning off lights, et cetera.
So a quick follow-up to that. If I recall correctly, I believe that eWeb at one time or may still have a program that I know that's targeted at homeowners for weatherization and other issues, but do you know if eWeb has a program that would provide that similar assistance for renters and other property owners?
I guess I can't speak to it. I know that they do have a program for residences. For residents. I don't know how much it targets people in multifamily housing. But I guess I would just reiterate that that's a tough market to crack, and I don't.
I think it would be real important if we would be able to work with eWeb around that, particularly around those equity issues, because, again, if people don't have the money to be able to do this with their residences, we need to be able to figure out ways to be able to reduce emissions in this context. Councilor Taylor, and then Councilor Zelenka. And Councilor Clark is in the queue.
Thank you. I have a question about, I'm on the LRAPA board, Lane Regional Air Protection Agency. We try to make a point of saying the whole thing so people know what it is. And we've been asked to take a stand on car emissions, inspections of cars. Have you discussed that, or might you discuss that?
It's not something that's currently within our Climate and Energy Action Plan. It could be considered when we do an update of the community-wide plan. I've had some conversations with folks at LRAPA as well about that, but it's not something that's currently up for discussion that I'm aware of.
Well, I think all of us have been behind the car at some point. That's almost choking us. But and many cities do have inspections. I think that's something that does have something to do with air quality and sustainability.
Yes.
And how about protection of trees? Is that anything you talk about?
Yes, absolutely. Within especially the climate adaptation side, thinking about our urban forest is a big focus. So yes, it's very important.
Our current code, we've tried to make, some of us have tried to make it more strict, but currently people can log land at 5 trees a year and until they destroy them all. And I'm curious, I have a question. I don't want to start I have a question about how you so quickly made a comment, took a stand on the rezoning of South Willamette.
That wasn't us as staff, that was a Sustainability Commission.
A Sustainability Commission so quickly took a stand.
Do you want to take?
Because some things seem to take forever, and almost instantly there was a stand taken on that, and I don't know how much discussion there was.
If you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I can just speak to the process that the Sustainability Commission has gone through. They actually have had land use and transportation issues on their work plan for several years running now, and have been tracking a number of land use issues, including the South Willamette Special Area Zone. As you know, the commission meets once a month, and then they have these committees that are assigned specific areas of focus. So in addition to the full commission, they've had a committee focused on this. So there have been a series of meetings and discussions that led up to that testimony that you heard from the chair of the commission.
So I heard that there was a committee of 3 people, right?
You know, I'd have to go and check, but that sounds about right. But the full commission weighed in on the testimony before it was delivered.
Committee brings it to the commission. The commission
Right. I was just amazed at how quickly that happened. Thank you.
Councilor Zelenka.
Yeah, this is a very timely topic, given next week the world will meet in Paris to convene a meeting to discuss and decide about greenhouse gas reduction goals for the world and individual countries, and that will occur in the first 2 weeks of December. So this is really timely. I do have some hope. There's 157 countries that actually are coming to Paris with plans and commitments to reduce greenhouse gases. Kind of filters down from the world level to the national level to the state level to the local level, which is, in our part, is the Climate Recovery Ordinance and the implementation of that ordinance, I think. Thank you for bringing the numerical goals and targets and benchmarks. A little bit late, but better late than never. The way the ordinance was crafted, it makes it look like the community-wide goal and the options for meeting the goals has no deadline in it, and because it's oddly worded in section 4 on page 11 of our subsection 4 on page 11 of our AIS. My intent was, when crafting this, that the community-wide goal and the options for meeting the goals, the plan, would actually be included in this 1-year look back, which is a little bit past 1 year. So, but I can see by reading this, and that's why it says in section 4, including options for meeting the goals, the manager shall include triple bottom line analysis and options for including a cost-benefit analysis. But I can see from reading this that it's unclear. So I guess the question I have is, when will we see the options for meeting the 2 goals, the plan for doing this? What's the timeline for that?
On the internal side, we're actively working with a team of staff to update the strategies that we're using for internal emissions reductions. We'll have a report that will go back to our executive management team by the end of February. So that would be that would address the internal side. As we mentioned to you all when we were here in February, our focus was going to be first on the internal emissions because we have greater control of them and because they're flat and not trending as steeply downward. So the decision was to focus there. So on the community side, we're not as advanced in updating strategies, but we have completed, as I showed you here, the community-wide greenhouse gas inventory to provide us that next baseline to work from as we do an update.
So do you have, I didn't hear you say any dates about when you're bringing this back to council for
On the community side,
both.
on the internal side, yeah, I don't know when that will come back to council. It'll go to our execs in February and beyond that. It's up to them, I think, to determine when to bring it back to you.
Mr. City Manager, do you have a sense of the time frame for moving this forward and bringing it back to council?
I don't know. As far as we get something in February, what we will do as execs is take a look at that, see where we are, and then say, yes, that's the strategy that we're on. May or may not have budget implications, which is sort of leading into that stage there. So it would be relatively soon after the February date, but I couldn't give you a specific date.
Yeah, okay. And then, of course, any plan, of course, isn't just, we're not meeting our goals by just taking actions here at the city. We're meeting our goals by accumulating a series of actions, including those at the federal and the state level that have a whole bunch of different ramifications throughout our society. So it's all those embedded, and then there's at the end, when there's nothing left to do, then there's our community ones. Is there an interim plan to talk about the two-year benchmarks before the progress report, which is required 2 years after we adopt the benchmark? I don't want to see us come back on 2020 and say, oh, we're not meeting the target and we're going to start now. Can you assure me that that's not the
Alan,
plan?
do you need another round?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I finish my question?
Go ahead. I would let you finish the question, but I just need
Can you assure me that that's not the plan, and especially since EWEB seems to be going backwards in terms of eliminating conservation programs and backtracking on renewables?
What I would say is our intent is to meet the intent of what the council has set as the goals. And so what that means is there are certain goals by 2020. There's internal and external goals. Of course, we have more control over the internal than we do the external. And so our intent is to do what we can to meet those goals that council has set out. And so if the goal is 2020, what we wouldn't do is come back in 2020 and tell you, now we're ready to start trying to meet those goals. So
that's the point of the progress report every 2 years.
Councilor Clark. Mike?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Matt, thank you very much for the report. Greatly appreciated.
Thanks.
Yeah, I've got you.
Several questions here. The first one being, I know I touched on it earlier, but you mentioned a reduction in gasoline and diesel use, but I didn't hear you talk about that measurement with regard to jet fuel. I know that's I seem to be beating on this a little bit. But my understanding is that we're increasing the number of flights from our airport. So can you address that, please, and tell me how you measure it within that scope of a decreasing line?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, that's my understanding, too, is that trips going in and out of our airport are increasing. We haven't in the past measured actual jet fuel use within our greenhouse gas inventories, though certainly we have historical data for fuel use. And within our inventory, we have tried to capture just the trips attributed to Eugene residents. And I won't go into the details of how we do that unless you'd like me to, but yes, jet fuel is a piece of that. I typically try and refer to it as transportation fuels, and jet fuel being a part of that.
Excellent. Thank you. On the other piece there, can you tell me some, without getting too deep in the weeds, of the methodology used to calculate other transportation fuels that are related to product delivery? I mean, I guess my question is, do you measure fuels that are purchased and sold in our area, or do you measure as well those trucks that come in to deliver products to the grocery store, for example?
Yeah, the fuel that's used for like deliveries that where the fuel is purchased out of town and brought into town, the piece that comes from the border of our city and into town is what we're trying to get at. So yes, we are measuring transportation of goods. That's a piece of it.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you. The other questions, I read an interesting article this morning that mentioned that for those who commute to work, in 1980, 64% of people who commuted to work by automobile did so alone, without anyone riding with them. And that today, nationally, that figure is 74%. So we have less people carpooling nationally today than we did in 1980. Can you tell me, it seems like you're indicating that's less true in Eugene. Do you measure that?
Yeah, we do measure that, and it holds true in Eugene as well. We have somewhere on the order of 80% of commute to work trips that are done by single occupant in a vehicle.
Okay. So my next question then is, do you measure gas emissions from idling vehicles and or the effect that congestion has on greenhouse gas emissions?
We don't measure specifically idling emissions from idling vehicles, but they're included within the reporting about transportation fuels that are used.
Will one of the large-term community strategies as we move forward include reducing congestion or idling behavior that increases the amount of gas that's produced?
That's not something that's included within our current plan. It certainly is something that could be considered within an update of our community plan. But I think it's worth noting that I haven't seen that in any climate action plans across the country. That doesn't mean it couldn't work here, but it's not a strategy that most communities are using to try and reduce fuel consumption. It's also worth noting... Go ahead.
It will be important to me personally when we get to that point where we're talking about community planning for us to talk about how we've measured congestion and idling and its effect on greenhouse gas emissions and what we're doing to reduce congestion.
All right, understood. I would also mention that it's on the positive side in that area. We are seeing increasing adoption of electric vehicles and hybrids that turn themselves off at slow speeds, so that may become less of a emissions source in the future.
I'd also note, although I don't want it to sound like a commercial for any one in particular, there are at least one manufacturer of electric vehicles locally that are beginning to enter the market, and I wonder if supporting them in any fashion will be a part of our longer-term community planning.
I don't know if we'll call it any manufacturers that are here in Eugene producing a three-wheel electric vehicle.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. I couldn't understand what you said. I apologize.
Yeah, I don't know if we'll call out any one manufacturer in particular, Arcimoto, that we might support that's here in Eugene.
Well, good. All right. Thank you, Matt, very much.
Thanks.
Councilor Pryor.
Yeah, actually, just quickly following up on something that Mike was asking about. I recall when I worked on Transplan, I think it was back in 2000, two measures that they did use was VMT. Everybody knows about vehicle miles traveled. But another one we did talk about was trip time. And so while it's not specifically related to idling, idling is inherent in trip time. And those were two factors that were very much important in terms of consideration for how to reduce gas emissions and everything else. So part of Transplan was improving the infrastructure, but it was also in terms of reducing emissions. So trip time was a factor, and I remember that because it was something we had some conversations around, whether you could do that with demand management or with infrastructure improvements. The question I had was, could you just give us a quick refresher, it doesn't have to be in detail, about the state and federal emission requirements that that the city is required to follow, so that I think people can get a sense that we didn't come up with a bunch of rules locally and say, we're going to create these emissions because we in our infinite wisdom say this is what we should do. But there is actually, it relates to state and federal emission guidelines and rules that have been created. Could you just give me just a few minutes on how the state and federal rules impact our need to reduce?
Sure. Yes, there have long been standards on automobiles for the amount of fuel that they consume. One, the efficiency standards, and those change over time. And there have also been emissions reductions standards of renewable fuel standards of the emissions that are associated with that fuel in particular So both reducing the fuel and reducing the emissions associated with a single gallon of fuel have been priorities at the federal level. The federal level has also recently set guidelines about reducing the emissions associated with the electricity that we're using here. So yes, there's certainly precedent on the federal and state level. In fact, our federal government has had a climate action plan in place since 1993. It hasn't been enacted on the way we might have liked if we're trying to meet these targets, but there's certainly a ton of precedent there.
And it might be worth mentioning the state targets that the Global Warming Commission has established.
Right. And in fact, within our Community Climate and Energy Action Plan, we adopted or incorporated the state level greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets, and those were established by the state, I believe, in 2005. Is that right, Councilor Zelenka?
Codified in 9.
Right, and then codified in 2009. Right, so there are targets in place there, and then, as you are all aware, there's been discussion at the state level about a price on carbon, which I think is worth noting is, from all the modeling that I've seen, is absolutely required if we're going to meet the targets that are set out here. So Eugene certainly can't go it alone, and you all, as a council, provided support at the state level for a carbon pricing mechanism of some kind. And I know that they're queuing up to have that discussion again in this coming legislative session.
So there's the side of it that says you want to reduce emissions because it's important and it's the right thing to do for the environment. But there's the other side that says there is some external regulatory or legal requirement to do it. And I hear there's a lot of guidelines and a lot of targets, but what are the specific regulatory or legal requirements that we reduce that either come from the state or the federal government? And the reason I'm asking that question is looking at your picture you had up there, a 60% reduction is a pretty, I looked at those lines and they go down pretty steep in a relatively short amount of time. And it's great to set that as a goal. I mean, it's really nice to do that. But I always think, what's plan B if you don't get there? And so I'm sure you're already starting to think about, what is the plan B for if we don't get there? We should try to get there, but if we don't, you always got to have plan B in mind. And would plan B come into conflict with not the targets or the guidelines, but would come into conflict with something that was legal or regulatory that we would need to be aware of? In other words, I don't want to, by missing something that we've set as a goal, to get sideways with something else. And so I want to know what my latitude is, not that I want to try to ratchet back, but I just want to know what I'm in for if I should or shouldn't be able to meet those targets.
Right. So my understanding of it, and this gets into an area where I'm not as familiar, so I'm going to step away from the details, but my understanding is that those regulations that are coming from the federal level are enacted at the state level. So to the extent that there are requirements about our electricity being, the emissions associated with electricity being reduced, the state is required to meet that, not the city of Eugene, and similar with the low carbon fuel standard.
Right. That's what I want to be clear on, is what external legal obligations do we have that we need to try to meet?
Yeah.
And you don't have to do, that may be something you need to get back with, but I'd be curious to know what constrains us from that standpoint.
Yeah, that's good thinking, and I'll take a look at it and get back.
Thank you.
Okay. We're going to move in this second round. Claire, I was going to ask if Claire or Mike, do you want to be in this round?
Mike already
Yes, please.
Okay, so Claire's in. And anybody else around the table? And then we'll go to Alan. Anybody else? Alan.
Claire said yes.
I know Claire said yes, but Alan, you're first, and then Claire.
Oh, she hasn't been in. I'm second round.
You're second round. So,
Right.
Claire, you want to be in this round? First round? Okay. Go ahead, Claire.
Thank you. So I just want to echo Councilor Zelenka's concern about what seems to be slow progress in terms of an update on our plan. I do really appreciate the good work presented here, but it feels like we're behind on the schedule we set out in our ordinance. There is a growing urgency around this issue, and we made a commitment to action that we need to follow through on. Councilor Taylor mentioned the Sustainability Commission earlier. The Sustainability Commission is tracking issues related to Envision Eugene, transportation, and zoning as a part of their regular work, and they get the urgency of this issue which might speak to their quick reaction to our recent vote on South Willamette and the R1 zoning. So I would like to see the same sense of urgency from our city manager to move us forward with a plan that we can use to hold ourselves accountable to moving forward on these important efforts. And I probably won't need a second round. Thanks.
Councilor Zelenka.
Yeah, I'll just underscore that, the sense of urgency. We need to be moving, the world needs to be moving in this path, not in 15, 20 years, but in the next 5 years and significantly down that road. So there is definitely a sense of urgency. You know, speaking of what Plan B is that we're going to spend a whole lot more on adaptation that's not going to work very well because we haven't done the mitigation. We're going to deal with sea level rise and inundation and more forest fires and more flooding and stronger storms and all the effects of those, as well as droughts and the food issues and the security issues around the world that presents to us. CIA came out with a report just a couple of years ago that said this is one of the most significant security issues to the threat of the United States, and we need to be working on it. There are significant issues from vehicles, and that is an appropriate place to be looking, and that's why we're looking there. Something like 40% of the emissions come from the transportation sector. That's why we have the Clean Fuels Program, and for instance, the Global Warming Commission's metric has 43% electric vehicles by 2035. So there is to get to that steep curve, you need to do a lot of stuff. And jet fuels, significant reductions via alternative fuels. Alaska Airlines has been working in the last couple of years on biofuels to have substantial reduction in emissions. And just changing the slope of the glide path of a plane in and out of an airport substantially reduces the amount of fuel used. So there's not any one thing. I'll reiterate. There's not a silver bullet that's going to answer climate change. It's going to be silver buckshot. A bazillion little things that are going to add up to a whole lot. Specifically, I had a question about one of the points in the AIS. It's on page 7. The second bullet, and it says significant emission reductions will likely take a long time to pay back before the organization experiences ongoing savings. And I'm curious about that statement. What's the basis for that, since we don't have a plan, so we don't have specific actions? I'm kind of curious how that conclusion was drawn, and we don't have a cost-benefit analysis yet. And my professional experience is that that's contradictory to what I've seen and what I've experienced, which is climate action plans, especially in the short term, that focus on cost-effective measures actually create immediate savings that can be plowed back into the organization. And certainly one wouldn't do the least cost-effective thing first. You would do the most cost-effective thing first and thereby create those savings, things like energy efficiency and cost-effective renewables, fleet fuel reduction, some of the things we've already done, but many more things that we'll need to do. So I'm curious where that conclusion kind of comes from. It stuck out to me as not ringing quite right.
Okay. So the city has had a pretty aggressive energy efficiency program in place since the mid-1990s, and really that's a large part of it. A lot of cities are seeing immediate reductions because they're just now starting emissions reductions programs or efficiency programs, but we've had one in place for some time that, as I understand it, has done the vast majority of the things that pay back in about 10 years. That's the standard that is typically used within our facilities energy management program. So by definition then, the things that would be queue up on the facility side next would have 10 years or perhaps a slightly longer amount of time before they start before they pay for themselves and start to result in ongoing savings. A little bit different story on the fleet side, but most of our emissions reductions there are substitution of biofuels, which don't end up saving or costing a lot on either end.
Can you flip back to the pie chart slide?
Yeah.
Okay.
Alan,
do you need another round here?
Just real quick. Can you explain, not that one, the next one?
The internal side?
Yeah. Yeah. Can you explain the supply chain and how that plays into this and what the actions are there?
Yeah, so on this supply chain,
It's 57%.
it's a big piece, and a lot of that comes from it's large-scale construction projects that use a lot of concrete and asphalt. Road construction projects and building construction projects is the lion's share of that. It's not all of it. There are certainly other things. We buy pool chemicals, which are particularly greenhouse gas intensive. We pay for other services, and those services that we're buying, the work associated with the surface that we're contracting for has emissions associated with it, so that falls under supply chain as well. But again, the lion's share being concrete and asphalt. When cement is made, it's limestone baked at 2,000 degrees with natural gas, and there's just a lot of embodied energy in that. And we do a lot of road repair, which is necessary. I would say, reiterate though, both on the concrete and the asphalt side, that our public works staff are really at the leading edge of finding different ways to do that. In fact, there are some substitutions on the concrete side that have been experimented with in Oregon at levels that aren't being done in other places, and really substantially reducing emissions by 30 or 40%. It's pretty significant.
Okay. Any other questions or comments from council? If not, then I'll gavel us out of this, and we'll be back at 7:30.
Yeah.